The Watchers in the Rain. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse groaned shut behind Judge Malcolm Hewitt, their weight echoing through the vast marble hall, as if sealing something away, or perhaps letting something in. The storm outside was relentless, rain slamming against the stone steps in sheets, cascading down into rushing streams along the cracked pavement. Lightning splintered across the sky, momentarily washing the city in electric silver, while thunder rolled close behind, deep enough to rattle the courthouse windows. Malcolm tugged his coat tighter around his shoulders, shifting the leather briefcase in his hand. His fingers, long and pale from years of paperwork rather than labor, curled tightly around the handle. His knuckles gleamed white in the dim light. Long day, he thought, though they all were. Sentences handed down, lives altered with the strike of his gavel. The routine weight of power, carefully managed over 2 decades on the bench. Jonathan, his driver, was already waiting at the bottom of the steps, standing beside the gleaming black sedan with an umbrella in hand. The older man's salt and pepper hair was combed back with military precision, his gloved hand steady against the wind. A fixture in Malcolm's life for over 5 years, Jonathan was a quiet, dependable man, his silent presence as comforting as the car itself. But it wasn't Jonathan Malcolm saw first. There at the edge of the courthouse steps, just where the rain bulled into mist, stood 2 boys, twins, dark-skinned and slender, their drenched clothes clinging to their small frames. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, identical down to the sodden blue hoodies hanging from their shoulders and the sneakers with mismatched laces. The rain had plastered their short, tight curls to their foreheads, and rivulets of water ran down their cheeks like tears, though neither boy seemed to notice. What stopped Malcolm cold wasn't their presence. Stray kids often loitered near the courthouse, but the way they stared. They were watching him. Not just watching, waiting. Their eyes, deep and dark, seemed to cut through the rain and the gathering dusk, pinning him to the spot. There was no plea in their faces, no mischief, no fear, just quiet, unrelenting expectation, as though they knew something Malcolm didn't. "Sir," Jonathan's voice broke through the storm. "Your car's ready." Malcolm startled, shaking off the unnatural stillness that had seized him. "Yes, of course." He descended the steps with careful, deliberate steps, but his eyes kept flicking back to the boys. They didn't move, not even to blink. Even when he passed within a few feet of them, they stood as still as statues. He should have said something, asked if they were lost or needed help. Instead, his throat tightened, a memory too faint to surface brushing the edge of his mind. The rain blurred his vision, and Malcolm slipped into the safety of the car, the door closing with a reassuring thunk. As Jonathan pulled the car away from the curb, Malcolm craned his neck to glance back through the rear window. The boys remained rooted to the steps, their small faces blurred by rain and distance, but still, those eyes followed him, unwavering, as though they could see straight into his heart. At home, the storm followed him, battering the windows of his brownstone as he ate a dinner he couldn't taste. The house was too large and too empty since Sarah's passing. His wife had been gone 3 years, her absence a constant hollow space at his side. His daughter, Hannah, called twice a week, but lived states away, caught up in her own life, a life Malcolm had always supported from a careful distance. The boys' faces wouldn't leave him. After washing his dishes, Malcolm pulled open the front curtains, looking down onto the rain-slicked street. The twins were there again, standing directly across from his house, just beyond the glow of the street lamp. Soaked, silent, still. His chest tightened with something between unease and guilt, an old, buried kind of guilt, the sort that had no name but left a taste like metal on his tongue. He closed the curtains with more force than necessary, retreating to his study where the oak-paneled walls and bookshelves promised logic and order. The following day, they were waiting outside the courthouse again. This time in dry clothes, matching black jackets and jeans, but with the same expectant stillness. Their presence was beginning to gnaw at Malcolm's composure. He was not a man easily unsettled. His years on the bench had made him immune to tears, pleas, even threats. But this was different. He tried ignoring them, immersing himself in case files and proceedings, but every break, every glance out the window, there they were, waiting. By the end of the week, Malcolm couldn't take it anymore. Rain lashed against his windshield as Jonathan navigated the city's dark streets, but the boys were there again, standing outside his home, their thin figures hunched against the cold. He stepped out onto the porch, rain soaking his hair before he could open his umbrella. His breath fogged in the air as he called across the street, voice sharp with irritation masking his unease. "Who are you? What do you want?" The twins exchanged a glance, brief, flickering, before the one on the left reached into his pocket. Malcolm tensed, but all the boy produced was a folded piece of paper, water-stained and worn. Slowly, they crossed the street together, their movements eerily synchronized, until they stood at the foot of Malcolm's steps. The boy held out the paper with fingers trembling only slightly. Malcolm took it, the rain immediately soaking the fragile page, ink bleeding at the edges. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, corners softened from handling. The headline blurred in the rain, but Malcolm could make out the first words. "Local man sentenced to life in 2003 robbery and murder." He felt the world shift under his feet. He knew this case, knew it in the marrow of his bones. The rain blurred the grainy photo beneath the headline, but Malcolm didn't need to see it. He could already picture the man's face, young, desperate, pleading. The same face he'd sentenced to life behind bars. The same face that had haunted his dreams in the quietest hours. "You put our father away," the boy on the right said quietly. The first words Malcolm had heard from either of them. His voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the accusation in it, the heavy weight of those 5 simple words. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. The wind howled around them, rain slashing sideways across the street. The boys didn't move. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent sentinels under the storm. Malcolm stumbled back inside, the door slamming shut behind him. His hand shook as he set the clipping on his desk, water dripping from his coat onto the hardwood floor. He stared at the article, the ink smudging beneath his fingertips. A 20-year-old case, a conviction he hadn't questioned in years. A man buried by evidence that, at the time, had seemed ironclad. But now, the weight of it crushed down on him with terrifying clarity. If those boys were who they claimed to be, if their father had been innocent all along. Malcolm sat heavily in his chair, the house creaking under the storm's fury. The twins were still out there, waiting, just as they'd waited every day for their father to come home. And now, they were waiting for Malcolm, waiting for him to do what he hadn't done 20 years ago. See the truth. Echoes from the bench. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with something heavier than humidity, the kind of weight that lingered long after the skies cleared. Judge Malcolm Hewitt stood at his living room window, the morning sunlight pouring in soft and golden, glinting off the wet pavement outside. But the light did nothing to soften the silhouettes standing at the curb. The twins were there again. Dry now, but no less unnerving. For 3 days, Malcolm had barely slept. Every time his head touched the pillow, his mind conjured the image of that clipping. Local man sentenced to life in 2003 robbery and murder. The ink seeping into his memory like blood into fabric. He told himself the evidence had been strong. It was airtight. It had to be, hadn't it? The faces of the twins stared back at him through the window. No words, no gestures, just a presence that was beginning to wear him down in ways he didn't fully understand. Malcolm's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He nearly knocked over his coffee grabbing it. Malcolm. It was Beth, his younger sister, the only person in his life who still called without an agenda. Her voice, warm and familiar, cut through his rattled nerves like a balm. "You okay? You sound off. He closed his eyes, rubbing his forehead. I'm fine. A beat of silence. Liar. Malcolm swallowed hard. Beth had always been able to see through him, even when they were kids. She was the talker, the connector, the only one who could make his stoic silence crack. And right now, his walls were thin. Something weird is happening, he admitted. There are these two boys, twins. They keep showing up everywhere. Outside the courthouse, my house. They don't talk. Just watch. Beth's tone sharpened. What do they want? Malcolm hesitated. They handed me a newspaper clipping. Okay. It was about a case. One of mine. Beth's silence was loaded, the kind that demanded he fill it. They said I put their father away. There was no dramatic gasp, no exclamation. Beth's voice, when she spoke, was quiet. And did you? Malcolm turned back to the window. The twins hadn't moved. I thought I did. The courthouse archives were colder than Malcolm remembered. Maybe it was the outdated air conditioning, or maybe it was the weight of what he was about to unearth. The smell of old paper and disinfectant hung heavy in the air as Mrs. Dunlop, the longtime records clerk, shuffled toward him. She squinted through her bifocals. Judge Hewitt, haven't seen you down here in years. Something I can help you find. Malcolm cleared his throat, the words feeling strange in his mouth. I need the complete case file for. He pulled the crumpled clipping from his pocket, smoothing it against the counter. State v. Jonah Briggs, 2003. Mrs. Dunlop's eyebrows crept up her forehead, but she didn't ask questions. She disappeared into the maze of shelves, the whisper of her shoes on tile the only sound in the room. Malcolm's heart pounded in his ears. He remembered the case now, how the name had sunk its teeth into his subconscious the moment the twins handed him the article. Jonah Briggs, a small-time mechanic with no prior arrests, a man with 2 baby sons at home. He'd been accused of killing a store clerk during a robbery gone sideways. It was supposed to be open and shut. Surveillance footage, grainy, but clear enough. A shaky eyewitness, a weapon with partial prints. But why couldn't he remember the trial clearly? Mrs. Dunlop returned with a heavy box, her thin arms trembling under the weight. Malcolm thanked her quietly and carried the file to one of the long, scarred wooden tables beneath the flickering fluorescent lights. The first page punched him in the gut. State v. Jonah Briggs. Presiding Judge, Malcolm Hewitt. His own signature, bold, confident. At the bottom of the first hearing transcript, he flipped through the yellowed pages, his fingers almost mechanical, the details unfurling like a map to somewhere dark. The robbery had been chaotic. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. One claimed Jonah had a silver handgun. Another swore it was black. The security footage, poor resolution, shadowed faces, had been the crown jewel of the prosecution. Malcolm remembered his own certainty back then, his belief in the integrity of evidence. The witness statements had seemed fractured, but the weapon found in Jonah's garage had felt like the final nail. Except, Malcolm frowned. The evidence log listed the gun's retrieval date, 3 days after the initial search. That wasn't unusual in itself. Evidence could be overlooked in a cluttered garage. But the officer who found it, Detective Raymond Keyes, had resigned a year later amid rumors of evidence tampering in an unrelated case. Malcolm's stomach turned. He read further. There was something odd about the surveillance footage. According to the chain of custody, the original tape had been misplaced for nearly 2 weeks before resurfacing, edited and spliced for clarity. The court had accepted the clean version. Back then, it had seemed reasonable. Now, it felt like a crack in the foundation. That night, the twins stood at the bottom of his front steps again. Malcolm didn't turn off the lights or pretend not to see them. Instead, he stepped out into the cool air, the darkness settling like a second skin around him. Come inside, he said. The boys exchanged another silent glance, then climbed the steps in perfect sync. Inside, they stood just inside the threshold, their small hands clasped in front of them. Water dripped from their sneakers onto his polished hardwood floors, but Malcolm didn't care. "I need to know everything," he said. For the first time, the boys sat, stiff and formal, on his sofa, their feet barely touching the floor. The boy on the left, Malcolm thought maybe his name was Micah, spoke first. "We never knew him," he said softly. "Not really." Malcolm sat across from them, hands folded tightly. "Your father." The other twin, Malcolm guessed Miles, nodded. "We were babies when they took him." Micah's fingers traced the seam of his jeans. "He wrote us letters, from prison, but they didn't always let them through." Miles stared at Malcolm, eyes so like Jonah's that the judge had to look away. "Our mom told us stories about him, that he was a good man, that he didn't do what they said." "Your mother," Malcolm said, his voice hesitant. "Where is she now?" Both boys were silent. "She passed," Micah whispered. "Last year." Malcolm's chest constricted. "She made us promise," Miles added, his voice stronger. "Promise we'd make someone listen, even if it took the rest of our lives." Malcolm felt the breath leave his lungs. The weight of their quiet determination was heavier than any gavel he'd ever held. These boys, they had been children without a father, now orphans with a mission. "What do you want from me?" he asked, though he already knew. Miles' dark eyes gleamed. "The truth." Malcolm sat in his study long after the twins had gone, the house once again silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. The Briggs file lay open on his desk, the pages curling at the edges like they were trying to fold in on themselves and hide. The man he had been, the confident, decisive judge, had believed in the law's clarity. But the man he was now, sitting alone in a too-large house, felt the edges of everything fraying. He had trusted evidence, trusted police, trusted the process. But process was not the same as truth. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old contacts until he found the number he hadn't dialed in years. The line rang, then clicked. "Detective Keyes," a hoarse voice answered. "Ray," Malcolm said, his voice thick. "I need to talk to you. About Jonah Briggs." The silence stretched long enough that Malcolm thought the call had dropped. Then Keyes whispered, "I was wondering when you'd call." The cracks in the foundation. The rain had eased by the time Judge Malcolm Hewitt stood outside the rusted gate at the edge of a dying cul-de-sac. The neighborhood felt like a ghost, one of those places time had abandoned, where paint peeled in long curls from sagging porches and stray cats picked through overflowing trash cans. The house itself, number 17 Mayfair Street, leaned slightly to one side, as though the foundation had grown too weary to hold it up any longer. The dim porch light flickered weakly, and Malcolm wasn't sure if it was the bulb or the building itself that was shuddering under the weight of years. His knuckles hovered over the door before he knocked. 3 sharp raps that echoed too loudly in the silence. His breath curled in the cool air, misting as he stepped back. The door opened an inch, the chain catching, and a sliver of a face peered out. Detective Raymond Keyes, though Malcolm barely recognized him. The broad-shouldered, confident man from 2 decades past was gone, replaced by a shrunken, gray-faced ghost with bloodshot eyes and a week's worth of stubble. His once proud shoulders hunched forward, his shirt hanging loose on his frame like borrowed skin. Keyes' eyes flickered with brief recognition before narrowing with suspicion. "What the hell do you want, Hewitt?" Malcolm cleared his throat. "We need to talk." The door shut. Then, after a pause, the chain rattled loose. The door creaked open fully, and Keyes stepped aside. "Then talk." The inside was worse. Newspapers were stacked against the walls, some yellowed, some new, all leaning like crooked gravestones. Ashtrays overflowed on the coffee table, and the air stank of stale smoke and sweat. A lone ceiling fan creaked overhead, its uneven blades chopping lazily through the silence. Malcolm didn't sit. "It's about Jonah Briggs," he said. Kay's flinched as if the name was a hand across the face. Why now? Kay's voice was a rasp, his throat as cracked as the plaster walls. 20 years too late for all that. Malcolm took a slow breath. His sons found me. That got Kay's attention. He turned, dragging one hand down his face. The twins, he muttered. They never stopped. Malcolm's brow furrowed. You knew about them. Of course I knew, Kay said, voice low, eyes darting toward the window as though they might be out there right now, watching. They've been trying to get someone to listen for years. Kids don't give up like that. Not when they're all each other's got. Malcolm took a step closer. Kais, did you plant the gun? The question hung there, a razor between them. Kay stared down at his hands, fingers twisting together. You always thought you were the smartest guy in the room, didn't you, Hewitt? He gave a humorless laugh, a dry cough mixed in. You never asked questions back then. You were happy to bang that gavel, move on to the next case. I trusted you, Malcolm said quietly. I trusted the evidence. The evidence, Kay sneered. You know how many cases we had back then. Pressure to clear them, pressure to close. It was a numbers game, Malcolm. Clean stats, clean cases, clean careers. Malcolm's stomach knotted. So you framed him. Kay's didn't deny it. He was poor, had no alibi, no family to make noise for him. He was an easy target, and the case was a mess. He shrugged. A planted gun, a recovered tape. Doesn't matter if the wrong man goes down if the system looks clean. The air felt thicker than the smoke hanging in it. I put him away because of you, Malcolm said, voice low with anger. He lost his life, his family. So did I. Kay's roared, startling even himself with the force of it. You think I slept after that? You think I had Sunday dinners with my grandkids and didn't see his face every time I closed my eyes? The anger collapsed into something smaller, more brittle. He fell into the stained armchair, burying his face in his hands. I drank my way out of the department, Malcolm. You kept climbing. I kept falling. Malcolm's jaw clenched. You could have said something. You could have cleared his name. And you could have asked why the evidence didn't add up, Kay shot back. But you didn't. None of you did. You all wanted clean cases too. Malcolm's chest burned with the truth of it. He had been young then. Ambitious, eager to prove himself a fair and firm hand at justice. The kind of judge who could be counted on to uphold the law and clear the docket. I need you to go on record, Malcolm said, though the words felt like pebbles in his throat. A sworn statement. Keys laughed again, broken glass scraping pavement. There's no fixing it now. There has to be. Keys shook his head. They'll bury you if you try. You think those twins are the only ones who got screwed. You think you're the first judge to realize you've been playing in a rigged game. I don't care, Malcolm said firmly. Jonah deserves the truth. Jonah's rotting in a cell, Kais muttered, reaching for a cigarette with trembling fingers. The truth doesn't matter there. Malcolm stepped toward the door. It matters to his sons. Kais didn't answer, and Malcolm left him there, drowning in the house where every room was haunted by ghosts of his own making. Malcolm was halfway home when the streetlights flickered. He slowed at the corner, his pulse quickening as the glow caught on two familiar figures standing just beyond the crosswalk. The twins. They didn't wave. They didn't speak. They just stood, side by side, shadows pooling at their feet like black ink bleeding into the street. Malcolm pulled over, rolling down his window. I saw him, he called out, the words hanging awkwardly between them. Detective Kais. The twins didn't react. He told me everything. Still nothing. Malcolm swallowed hard. I'm going to help you. For a brief moment, Micah's fingers curled into fists at his side. Malcolm wasn't sure if it was hope or frustration that flickered in his dark eyes. Either way, they turned and walked away, blending into the night like smoke. That night, Malcolm pulled every case file from his personal archives. the ones from his early years on the bench, when he was still learning how to wield power and responsibility without losing himself. One by one, the names stacked up. Defendants with no money, no strong defense, cases with neatly tied bows that felt too clean now. He recognized the pattern in them. Every case Detective Case had been involved in. The files were full of shortcuts and staged conclusions, planted evidence, intimidated witnesses, and small-time offenders thrown into a system designed to devour them. Jonah Briggs was just one of many. By dawn, Malcolm's office was a sea of open folders, paper spilling onto the floor like spilled secrets. There was no denying it now. The justice he'd sworn to uphold had been bent, shaped, twisted by the hands of men like Kai's. Men he had trusted, men who had used his faith in the system as a weapon. His phone buzzed. A message. "Micah, we're outside." Malcolm stepped onto his porch, the rising sun casting the world in gold. The twins stood at the bottom of the steps, the first light softening their features, making them look young and fragile. Just kids, still holding the weight of their father's absence on their thin shoulders. "I'm reopening the case," Malcolm said quietly. Miles lifted his chin. "Even if they come after you." Malcolm's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Especially if they come after me." The twins didn't smile, but they both nodded. A silent pact, an understanding forged in grief and resilience. "We'll be watching," Micah said softly. "I know," Malcolm replied. And for the first time, the watching didn't feel like judgment. It felt like hope. The weight of silence. The rain had stopped, but the sky hung low, heavy and swollen with the threat of more to come. Judge Malcolm Hewitt stood at the wide windows of his office, looking down at the courthouse steps. He knew they'd be there. And they were. Micah and Miles stood side by side, just as they always did, their thin frames framed by the dull morning light. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. They stood like sentinels, silent, patient, waiting for him to act. Malcolm exhaled slowly, turning away from the window. The case file for State v. Jonah Briggs lay open on his desk, pages scattered, some old and yellowed, others printed only hours earlier. He had spent the entire night combing through evidence, witness statements, and old court transcripts. What he found chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just Jonah Briggs' case. There were others. 7 cases, all involving Detective Keyes, all with missing evidence, altered timelines, or coerced testimony. Malcolm had presided over 3 of them. The realization gnawed at his insides like acid. He had been part of it, unwitting, but part of it nonetheless. A judge too willing to believe what was placed in front of him. A man who had mistaken order for justice. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His secretary, Ruth, a woman who had worked with him for over a decade, stood there looking uncomfortable. "Judge Hewitt," she said softly. "The district attorney's office just called. Evelyn Chambers wants a word." She insisted. Malcolm's stomach tightened. Evelyn Chambers had built her career on protecting the system. She was ruthless in court, politically untouchable, and had a nose for threats to the status quo. And Malcolm had just become a threat. "I'll see her," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the twisting in his gut. The district attorney's office felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Evelyn Chambers' assistant barely looked up from her screen as Malcolm arrived, and when the door to Evelyn's private office swung open, the air inside felt razor-sharp. Evelyn stood at the window, arms crossed tightly, her perfectly tailored navy suit spotless, her silver hair coiled into a severe bun. She didn't turn right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch long enough for Malcolm to feel it settle into his bones. Finally, she spoke. "I've seen some judges self-destruct in my time," Evelyn said, her voice low and cutting. "But you might be the first to light the match yourself." Malcolm didn't move. "I assume you're referring to the Briggs case." Briggs. Keyes. The twins. Evelyn turned, her sharp eyes pinning him in place. I don't care how much sleep you've lost, Malcolm. You're about to ruin your career over a case no one remembers and a convict no one cares about." "I care," Malcolm said quietly. Evelyn's smile was thin, humorless. "That's your first mistake." He stepped closer, hands resting on the back of the visitor's chair, his knuckles pale against the leather. "They planted evidence, Evelyn. Keyes admitted it. And where's your signed affidavit from Keyes?" she asked smoothly. Malcolm said nothing. Keyes, predictably, had refused to put anything on paper, too afraid of the repercussions. All Malcolm had was a late-night confession soaked in regret and whiskey. "That's what I thought." Evelyn walked back to her desk, sitting gracefully, fingers steepled. "Here's the reality, Malcolm. If you reopen that case, you're not just putting your own reputation on trial. You're exposing the department, the DA's office, the system. Every conviction Keyes touched could unravel." "Maybe they should," Malcolm said, his voice quiet but firm. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't be naive. You know how this works. People trust the courts because we don't air our rot in public. You want to confess your sins. Do it in a retirement letter, not in open court." Malcolm felt the blood rising in his chest, the tightness in his throat threatening to break through his composure. 20 years, he said, barely above a whisper. "That man has lost 20 years. His sons grew up in foster homes, split up, shuffled between strangers, all because we wanted a clean conviction." Evelyn's face hardened. "I don't care." The coldness of it stunned Malcolm into silence. "This isn't about guilt or innocence," she continued, voice smooth as glass. "It's about stability. We can't afford to have people questioning every case we've handled for 2 decades. That's how you break public trust. That's how you destroy the system." Malcolm shook his head. "Maybe the system needs to break." Evelyn stood, her voice softening to something almost pitying. "You've had a long, respectable career, Malcolm. Don't throw it all away for a dead case and 2 orphans with a grudge." Malcolm turned toward the door. "They're not orphans," he said quietly. "Not yet." Malcolm sat in his car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, the engine off. Rain dripped from the courthouse roof, splattering against the windshield in uneven patterns. They would bury him if he did this. They would call him senile, say he was losing his grip. They'd tear apart his record, frame him as a man desperate for relevance in his twilight years. The system would protect itself. It always did. But then he saw them again. The twins stood at the edge of the courthouse lawn, their small bodies dwarfed by the granite facade behind them. Miles had his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched slightly against the cold. Micah stood perfectly straight, his gaze locked on Malcolm's windshield, eyes dark with quiet fury and something else. Hope. Malcolm opened the car door, stepping into the misting rain. The boys didn't move, but they didn't look away either. He crossed the pavement slowly, his shoes scuffing against the wet stone, until he stood directly in front of them. "Do you have the letters?" Malcolm asked. Micah pulled a worn envelope from his pocket, creased and weathered, but carefully preserved. Malcolm took it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was rough, uneven. "Jonas." He opened it carefully, reading the first line aloud. "To my sons, if you ever find someone willing to listen, tell them the truth. I'm innocent, and I'm still waiting for someone to see me." Malcolm's throat burned. "I'm listening," he said softly. The evidentiary hearing was set for Thursday morning. An emergency petition filed directly under his name, bypassing the usual bureaucracy. It was an audacious move, one no judge with a sense of self-preservation would ever make. Malcolm no longer cared about self-preservation. The courtroom was packed by the time he arrived. Journalists huddled in the back, their pens poised like weapons. Evelyn sat at the prosecution's table, her expression a mask of polite disdain. The gallery was filled with strangers, but at the very front, Micah and Miles sat side by side, their hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles shone. Jonah wasn't there. The prison transport was delayed. Another convenient obstacle. It didn't matter. The case had already been reopened in the court of public opinion, and Malcolm was ready to make his argument. He rose slowly, palms pressed flat against the table, his voice clear. "This court has long prided itself on upholding the law," Malcolm began. "But the law is only as strong as the people who enforce it. And when those people fail, when they manipulate evidence, silence witnesses, or destroy lives to preserve the illusion of justice, the law becomes a tool of oppression." He turned toward Evelyn. "We have a responsibility not to protect the system at all costs, but to protect the truth." Evelyn's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Malcolm's gaze swept over the room, resting briefly on the twins. "Jonah Briggs was failed by this court, by the police, and by me. This hearing isn't about protecting reputations or preserving careers." His voice softened. "It's about bringing a father home." Outside the courthouse, Malcolm stood in the rain, breath unsteady. The hearing was only the beginning. There would be appeals, motions, and relentless resistance from the system trying to crush him. But for the first time, Malcolm didn't feel the weight of it alone. Micah and Miles stood beside him, their small hands clutching the edges of his coat, anchoring him. "We're not done yet," Malcolm said. "We know," Micah said softly. But for the first time, they all believed they could win. Beneath the surface, the courthouse felt like a living thing now, not the stately, silent guardian of justice Malcolm Hewitt had once believed it to be, but a creature with veins and secrets, pulsing beneath its polished floors and towering columns. Its breath filled the hallways with whispers, the ghosts of forgotten trials haunting every inch of marble. Malcolm stood at the edge of the records room, staring at a wall of locked cabinets. These were the deep files, the evidence logs and internal memos not part of public case files. This was where mistakes were buried under layers of procedural jargon, where the system hid its sins. Micah and Miles stood beside him, their presence an anchor now instead of a warning. They had become his silent shadows, following him into places no children should have to go. They were only 10, but they carried themselves like they were much older, because life had forced them to be. "We shouldn't be here," Miles whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "We have to be," Malcolm replied. His keycard, the one he'd held for nearly 2 decades, still worked, though he suspected after today it might not for much longer. The green light on the lock flickered to life, and with a faint click, the door swung open. Rows upon rows of manila folders stretched into the dimness, each labeled with case numbers and dates. The air was thick with dust and the musty scent of paper left undisturbed for too long. Jonah Briggs' file was supposed to be in Box 47C, except Box 47C was missing. Malcolm's stomach turned to lead. "They knew I'd come looking," he muttered. Miles glanced up at him. "Who?" "The same people who framed your father." Malcolm's voice was steady, but inside, the knot of frustration and dread twisted tighter. Micah's hand hovered near a lower shelf. "What about these?" Malcolm knelt beside him, fingers tracing along the dusty labels. These were case audits, internal reviews conducted when procedural errors were flagged. These files weren't meant for judges' eyes, only internal investigators who rarely made noise when they found cracks in the system. There, tucked between 2 unrelated cases, was a half-sized file labeled Briggs, Jonah, Internal Review, 2003. Malcolm pulled it free. It was thinner than it should have been. No transcripts, no evidence photos, just a single sheet of paper. Summary of internal review findings. Evidence handling irregularities noted. Detective Raymond Keyes deviated from approved protocol. No further action recommended. Case closed. That was it. One sentence, one shrug, one decision to bury everything. Malcolm's hand shook, the paper trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. "Why would they hide this?" Micah asked. "Because admitting the truth would unravel everything," Malcolm replied, voice tight. If they admitted they framed your father, every case Case touched could fall apart. Hundreds of convictions. Hundreds of lawsuits. Miles' brow furrowed. So they let our dad sit in prison so they wouldn't get in trouble. Yes. Neither boy spoke, but Malcolm saw the fury flicker in their eyes. Quiet and cold, but unrelenting. It was the kind of fury that only children robbed of innocence could carry. "We need more," Malcolm said, slipping the paper into his pocket. "One internal note won't break this open." Micah tugged at his sleeve. "What about the old evidence room?" Malcolm turned sharply. "What do you know about the evidence room?" Micah's shoulders hunched. We followed the people who work here sometimes. After school. They don't always lock the back door." Malcolm's first instinct was to scold them for sneaking around. But then again, if they hadn't, he wouldn't be here now. "Take me." The old evidence room was tucked into a forgotten corner of the courthouse basement, where the air was colder and the smell of mold clung to the concrete walls. The overhead lights buzzed weakly, flickering in fits as if the electricity itself was too tired to keep going. Micah led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who had memorized every creaky floorboard and shadowed hallway. The back door was propped open with a chipped brick. Someone had been here recently. Inside, shelves sagged under the weight of decades-old boxes, sealed evidence bags, tagged weapons, confiscated property from cases long forgotten. The silence was oppressive, the kind of quiet that made even breathing feel too loud. Malcolm scanned the shelves, fingers brushing over worn labels until he found it. Briggs, Jonah. Case evidence. The box was smaller than he expected, and the seal was intact, at least at first glance. Malcolm carefully lifted the lid. Inside were 2 evidence bags, one containing the silver handgun that had sealed Jonah's fate, the other containing a torn piece of cloth supposedly found at the crime scene. But something was wrong. The chain of custody log tucked inside the box was incomplete. Several signatures were missing, including the intake officer's signature the day the evidence was entered. That alone was damning. And then Micah's voice rang softly beside him. "Look!" The gun was marked as recovered from Jonah's garage, but the date on the label, July 17, 2003, was 3 days before the search warrant was issued. Malcolm's pulse pounded in his ears. It was impossible. Evidence couldn't be logged before it was found, unless it had been planted. "Can you prove they lied?" Miles asked quietly. Malcolm's fingers curled around the evidence bag, his knuckles white. "I can prove the chain of custody is corrupted. I can prove they tampered with the timeline." "Is that enough?" Micah's voice was small. Malcolm's mouth was dry. "It's enough to get people asking questions." Micah and Miles exchanged a look. That silent twin language Malcolm was beginning to recognize. There was no smile, no celebration. Just a nod, shared between them. It was enough. For now. The next morning, Malcolm stood on the courthouse steps, reporters already swarming the plaza below. The story was spreading. A judge reopening a decades-old case, publicly accusing the system he had served of burying the truth. There were whispers of senility, of a man cracking under pressure. Let them whisper. Micah and Miles stood to his left, their small hands tucked into their jacket pockets, their faces grimly determined. They had worn their best clothes, button-down shirts and scuffed dress shoes, hand-me-downs from the community center. When Malcolm stepped to the podium, the crowd hushed. "I've served this court for more than 20 years, Malcolm began, voice steady but hard-edged. "I've handed down sentences, upheld the law, and believed in the integrity of this institution." He glanced down at the twins, 2 small figures carrying the weight of what that belief had cost. "But believing isn't the same as knowing," Malcolm continued. "And in the case of Jonah Briggs, I know now that the system I trusted failed him." Cameras flashed. The air crackled with the tension of a room on the edge of combustion. Malcolm held up the evidence bag. This gun, the piece of evidence that condemned Jonah Briggs, was logged into custody 3 days before it was ever found. The chain of custody was manipulated. The evidence was planted. The truth was buried. The murmurs grew into a roar. I'm asking this court, and the public, to do what should have been done 20 years ago. Look past the surface. Ask the hard questions. Demand the truth. He stepped back, leaving the podium empty. The twins stood silently beside him, their hands gripping the edge of his coat, their presence no longer haunting, but anchoring. He had started this journey alone. But he wasn't alone now. That night, Malcolm sat in his study, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. His phone buzzed once. Unknown number. He answered. You shouldn't have done that, a voice said. Low, male, deliberately calm. Who is this? Malcolm asked, though he suspected he knew. You're making enemies, Judge, the voice continued. Big ones. The line went dead. Malcolm set the phone down, his hand shaking only slightly. The system was stirring, and it was angry. But across the room, on the mantel, sat a photograph Malcolm hadn't noticed in years. His own daughter, Hannah, at age 10, standing beside him on the courthouse steps, her hand in his. He wouldn't let Micah and Miles lose their father for another day. Whatever the cost, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. When the walls close in, the cold morning air bit through Malcolm Hewitt's overcoat as he stepped off his brownstone porch. The dawn sky was a smear of pale gray, the kind of color that hinted neither at storm nor sun, just emptiness. The street was eerily silent, but Malcolm wasn't surprised to see Micah and Miles standing at the edge of his driveway, exactly where they had stood the night before. They were always there now, his constant shadows, silent reminders that his decisions had long-reaching consequences. Their stillness, once unsettling, had become oddly comforting. They were his silent conscience, standing vigil over every step he took. But this morning was different. A black sedan idled at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the boy's small, solemn forms. The hum of the engine was the only sound on the street. It wasn't Jonathan's car. This was something else. A quieter threat. Malcolm pretended not to notice. He walked toward his own car, the twins falling into step beside him. No words passed between them. There was no need. They knew something had shifted. They were used to adults being afraid. Malcolm slid behind the wheel, Micah and Miles in the back seat. They said nothing as he drove, a silent caravan of three, past the courthouse, where reporters were already gathering, their cameras waiting to catch any glimpse of the judge who had dared to dig up the past. He didn't stop there. Not today. Today they had somewhere more important to be. The state correctional facility sat like a stone fortress on the edge of town, its razor wire glittering in the pale light. This was where Jonah Briggs had spent the last 20 years, an entire lifetime for his sons, a slow death for him. The guard at the gate recognized Malcolm immediately, his expression flickering between curiosity and apprehension. "Judge Hewitt," he said, lifting the barrier. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," Malcolm muttered. The twins followed him closely, their thin hands clenching the straps of their worn backpacks as they passed through the metal detector. No one questioned why they were there. Malcolm's presence gave them cover. The visitation room was stark. Metal tables bolted to the floor, plastic chairs that squeaked every time someone shifted. The room smelled of bleach and institutional hopelessness. Micah and Miles stood close together, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles turned white. The door at the far end opened, and Jonah Briggs shuffled in, chains clinking at his wrists and ankles. Malcolm's heart clenched painfully at the sight. Jonah was older, thinner, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of decades. His face was lined, but his eyes, Malcolm knew those eyes, were the same ones that had stared up at him from the defendant's table 20 years ago, begging for someone to see the truth. Micah's breath hitched audibly, and Miles' lip quivered, but they stood their ground. They had waited their whole lives for this moment. Jonah's step faltered when he saw them, his body jolting like he'd been struck. "My boys." His voice cracked, a hoarse whisper dragged from a place too deep for words. "Micah." "Miles." The twins didn't move at first, as though afraid if they did, he might vanish like a dream. Then Micah broke first, sprinting across the room and crashing into his father's arms. The chains made the hug awkward, but neither of them cared. Miles followed a heartbeat later, his arms wrapping around his father's waist, his face buried against the thin, scratchy prison uniform. Malcolm turned away, giving them what little privacy the room allowed. His throat burned. When Jonah finally looked up, his face wet with silent tears, Malcolm met his gaze. For the first time in 2 decades, there was no plea in Jonah's expression, only quiet recognition. "You remember me," Malcolm said softly. Jonah nodded slowly. "I remember all of them." His voice had no bitterness. That somehow made it worse. "We're reopening your case," Malcolm said. "I'm the one filing the motion." Jonah's brow furrowed. "Why?" Malcolm took a breath. "Because your sons never stopped believing you." Jonah's eyes flicked back to the boys, both still clinging to him like anchors. His hands trembled as he stroked their hair, as though relearning their faces by touch alone. "I told the truth," Jonah said softly, not to Malcolm, but to them. "I swear to you, I told the truth." "We know," Micah whispered fiercely. "We know, Dad." Jonah looked back at Malcolm. "They won't let this happen. Not without a fight." "I know," Malcolm said. "I'm ready." The fight started that afternoon. Malcolm was halfway back to the courthouse when the first call came. A private number, but the voice on the other end was familiar. "Judge Hewitt," said Evelyn Chambers, her voice perfectly smooth, like polished marble. "I strongly advise you to withdraw your motion." Malcolm gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Not happening." "There's still time to walk away with your reputation intact," Evelyn continued. "You know as well as I do that you're stepping into something much bigger than Jonah Briggs." "I'm not walking away," Malcolm said. There was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible. "You should be careful, Malcolm. You have more to lose than your career." The line went dead. The threat hung in the silence like smoke. The next day, Malcolm's personal records were leaked. Financial statements, health records, old legal memos from cases dating back decades, all neatly bundled and delivered to every major media outlet in the city. The headline ran in bold: "Judge Hewitt under scrutiny, amid claims of misconduct in Briggs case reopening." They were coming for him. Inside his office, Malcolm sat with the article in front of him, his phone vibrating with voicemails from reporters, colleagues, and former friends. The system was moving to crush him, to make him the story so no one would care about Jonah Briggs. The door creaked open. Micah and Miles stood there, their faces unreadable. "Are you in trouble?" Micah asked. Malcolm forced a smile, but the weight of it was too heavy. "I'm fine." Miles shook his head. "No, you're not." The voice stepped inside, standing beside his desk. Micah reached into his backpack and pulled out a small cassette tape, the kind old voice recorders used. "What's this?" Malcolm asked. Micah's expression was grim. "We followed that detective, Kaz, once, a long time ago, before he disappeared." Malcolm's heart skipped. "You recorded him?" Micah nodded. "He was drunk. He was talking to someone on the phone. About planting stuff. About our dad." Malcolm's hands shook as he took the tape. It was scratched and worn, but it might be exactly what he needed. "Why didn't you give this to anyone before?" Miles glanced at Micah, then back at Malcolm. "No one ever listened." Malcolm swallowed hard, throat tight with guilt. "I'm listening now." The tape played in crackling fits, but the voice was unmistakable. Detective Keyes. Whole thing was rigged from the start. Judge never asked questions, just took the evidence we gave him. I did what I was told. A pause. A deep, uneven breath. "You don't get it. They said they'd ruin me if I didn't go along. Said the DA was in on it. All of it. It wasn't just Briggs. It was everyone who made trouble. Malcolm closed his eyes, the weight of it pressing down like a hand on his chest. It wasn't just Keys. It was the whole damn machine. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the courtroom, tape in hand, Micah and Miles trailing close behind him. The reporters were there, the cameras, the whispers. But so were the boys. They weren't ghosts. They were witnesses, and the whole world was finally watching.